By the time Tyler's group returned to the somewhat boggy campsite, Anwen had more or less dried off. The Dragon Lord still had no idea how she'd gotten so wet in such a short amount of time, nor did he understand how she'd managed to somehow slip beneath his radar long enough to figure out the next clue. There definitely was a lot more to what had happened than she'd yet told them. Walter slipped his pack off his shoulders. He'd insisted on bringing it with them even though they'd left the rest of their gear at the campsite. One never knew when something might be needed, and he preferred to be prepared. He glanced at Anwen.
Okay.
He huffed, a little worn out from the trek back.
Will you please tell us what's going on?
For her part, Anwen didn't seem as out of sorts as she should be, all things considered. She was a bit out of breath, her knees stung from falling on the courtyard, but that was about it. She knew she'd be sore in a few hours, though, when things calmed down again.
I told you. I found the next clue.
Tyler couldn't help but shake his head. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't just look into her mind without doing more. Maybe their soul sharing didn't allow for that. Maybe it was too early to tell.
Yes, we heard that part.
He sighed.
And the question is how? We only had our backs to you for no more than 2 seconds.
Anwen couldn't help but smile a bit. The memory of the sound of the joyful giggling, the feel of the vibrating earth underfoot, made it hard to resist. She could no more explain it than she could explain how she saw light, but she tried.
With an effort, she told her companions what had happened from the moment they turned to scan the rest of the ruins until she reappeared.
Walter's expression was skeptical at best as he listened. It was indeed an incredible tale, and unless something supernatural had been at work, there was no way it could be credible.
So, you're saying you somehow knew to find this temple thing in the ruins, but you didn't at the same time? Okay.
He couldn't quite wrap his head around it.
There hadn't been any opening where she'd described one.
He knew because he'd looked.
Hold on.
Tyler admonished.
What if Anwen didn't leave us in a physical sense?
He held up a hand to stave off any comments.
Just hear me out. What if her soul was called to the temple, and that's why we never saw her leave? Time runs differently on that plane.
He'd heard of such things happening before, but none in a long time. He had no way of explaining how it worked or why. He could only guess that it had something to do with the dragon stones Anwen carried with her. She did have 2 now, one in her ring and one in the master key. If it was caused by those 2 elements combining, the walker had to have anticipated this happening. If that were the case, it meant no one else would have been able to find the next clue without those 2 elements. He couldn't help but wonder how far back they'd known something like this would happen.
I'm sorry if it doesn't make any sense.
Anwen apologized.
I just told you what happened. All I can do is tell you what the next clue is. And we can only go on from there. The sooner the better.
She dabbed at a scrape on her arm, waiting for Tyler to respond. Tyler nodded. It still didn't explain how she'd gotten soaking wet, but he supposed there were worse things. After all, Anwen was far from the typical of anything. It was possible the natural order of things didn't quite apply to her.
All right.
He conceded.
What's the next clue?
Across the plains you must venture, if your heart be true. Find the next turning in the middle. The beacons await you.
Anwen recited from memory. She could see the 3 pillars standing as if they were right in front of her.
I'm not sure what plains it means, though.
She looked at Walter. It took the veteran a moment to understand what she wanted.
Oh, right.
He fumbled in his pack until he found the map and pulled it out. Careful not to tear the ancient page, he unfolded it and placed it on a stone where everyone could see it.
We're about... right here.
He pointed, indicating the area below the forest of Sorwa.
Huh. From here, there seems to be a couple different planes to choose from.
But Tyler shook his head as he studied the map.
We don't need to choose. I already know which one.
He pointed to the vast area above the Draconi Mountains.
Here. It's the Follows Plains. They're not quite as far-reaching as they used to be in terms of untamed land, but if you go on a straight line between the city of Brintley near the northern mountains and the village of Lindworm, you'll find an ancient place most people tend to ignore. I doubt many even remember it's there.
The beacons.
Anwen breathed as she bent down to read the small print, her finger hovering over the map.
You don't see that on any of the modern maps.
Once more, the image of 3 stone pillars filled her mind.
I don't know. Something tells me that even though they're on the map, they won't be that easy to find.
Walter nodded.
Okay, so we have a general destination. The next question is, how do we get there? I know there are a lot of roads and such between there and the different cities. A lot have sprung up over the years, but we don't have a vehicle. And you've already said you're not gonna just fly us over there.
Tyler let out his breath.
You're right. The rest of the world would have a panic attack if they saw a dragon flying, even if it is the fastest way.
He began to pace over the uneven ground, though the terrain didn't seem to bother him. Anwen bit her lip. While the map Walter had was decent, it wasn't up to date. Something niggled at the back of her mind. It suggested her friends weren't considering something important as they thought about how to get to their next destination. There should be a lot of smaller towns between here and there.
And, if she wasn't mistaken, the train she'd taken from Blossy ran straight through the Falos Plains.
That had to count for something as well, though she didn't exactly have any money on her.
We could take the express.
She mused. If they could make it to Hollow Point, they should be able to connect with it.
There!
She pointed to the location. Tyler looked up, his hands dropping to his sides as he contemplated the map.
You know,
He said,
you might be right about that. I keep forgetting we're back on the 21st century, not back when I was a kid.
The reminder set Walter to thinking as well.
We'd have to find a way to Hollow Point. But I'm sure we could hitch a ride or something. We could even rent a car. I've got the cash.
He patted his pack, but the Dragon Lord held up one hand.
There's a slight problem with that plan, though.
He warned as he looked into his companion's eyes. He didn't blame their confusion.
The express doesn't stop any closer to our target than Brintley. From there, we can get a ride to some of the closer towns, but the beacons are in the middle of nowhere. We'll either have to hike in or something similar.
Anwen gave him a wry look.
What do you think we've been doing this past month? We can do it. And the sooner we get started, the sooner we find this walker person and our hidden group of mages.
Walter nodded in agreement.
What we can do is cut across to Hollow Point and rent an off-road vehicle instead. Nothing to it.
He glanced at Tyler, wondering what his thoughts on the matter were. He felt a sense of relief when he also nodded.
All right, let's get the rest of our stuff packed and head out.
He reached for his pack one more time, glad they'd already broken down the tents. As promised, Kern had asked a number of dragons to volunteer to help the mages train. Unfortunately, Courtney wasn't among them when they were chosen. Instead, she was required to visit with the Nurrim on a private hearing. She had no idea why, other than her stubborn nature. Part of her expected a stiff reprimand for making his subordinate look bad in front of the rest of the council.
She was more surprised to be summoned, not to the council chambers, but to Kern's private ones.
There was nothing that could have prepared her for the sheer size of his many rooms. Part of her supposed she should have guessed at what they'd be like. This was the Nurrim, after all. The walls seemed lined with crystal quartz, though she knew that wasn't the case. She had no name for the crystals all around, though. Part of her had the audacity to wonder if it wasn't any extension of the heart of the mountain, due to the way the light filtered through them. Kern had opted to transform to mortal form for this meeting. It made her feel at least a little more comfortable with everything. Part of his suite seemed purposefully situated to accommodate him in this form. There were even normal-sized furnishings. They were a bit outdated in fashion, but still quite comfortable. Courtney couldn't help but fidget as she sat down on the offered chair, though. The old dragon smiled at her antics.
You seem to be under the misapprehension that you are in some kind of trouble.
He teased gently.
I assure you, such is not the case. However, I would like to take this opportunity to clear up a few things, as well as to enlarge your understanding.
Courtney wasn't sure what to make of those statements as she stared into the kindly eyes of the elder dragon. She couldn't help but breathe from the sense of relief, though her heart still pounded in her chest. She knew this was not some casual tea party.
What things?
She asked, not sure she wanted to know, even though she wasn't really being given the choice.
What do you know of the origins of the dragons?
Kern asked as he looked up at her with curiosity. His expression was patient and compassionate. He remained always the teacher as he watched her squirm under his gaze. The mage looked down as she tried to remember all she'd heard about the topic. It wasn't much. Being, for the most part, self-taught didn't help. Finally, she shook her head as she looked back up.
Not much.
She confessed. Kern nodded.
I suspected this to be the case. Not many now remember. But I was there, at the dawn of this world, when the spirit of the mountain brought us into existence.
He stood and waved one hand. A smattering of energy shimmered into existence at his motion. It coalesced into the form of a sphere, different colors signifying the continents and oceans.
We were born from the heart of a star, which was used to give this planet life. that creative force charged us with the protection of this world. Unfortunately, at the same time we came into being, another form came also. Dark matter leaked into the world, creating our opposite.
Courtney watched as the energy shifted. It now showed a dark representation of what she'd seen on the mountain only a matter of a few weeks ago.
Revenants,
She said, watching with rapt attention. Ice ran down her spine at the thought.
Yes,
Kern confirmed.
they are our opposite in all things. Where we value creation and order, they honor destruction and chaos. It is their desire to cover this world with their darkness.
The image changed once more. This time it shifted into the form of a mortal.
Your kind was created to take possession of this world, leaving us as its guardians. These mortals spread out across the face of the land. Some believed in our existence, while others chose to forget us. Those who chose to live in harmony with us became the original keepers and helped us maintain order.
Once more, the image changed, now including a dragon who stood next to the mortal.
Over time, their number decreased in opposition of those who chose to disregard us. We came upon the need to distance ourselves from the other inhabitants of the world, and thus the first key, the Master Key, was created.
Courtney couldn't help but recognize the image now hovering in front of her. She'd seen it many times since meeting Anwen. Even now, she knew her friend carried the Master Key close, as was her right as the last in the line of the Master Keepers.
and then the mages were created when you fell in love with a mortal.
She mused. The energy shimmered before fizzing out like smoke. The Nurrim returned to his seat.
Yes. And then came the mages. But before that came something more. It is part of the reason Callum feels as he does towards mortals. His mother, and the mother of Damon, who you call Tyler, died because of one.
She couldn't help but gasp, one hand going to cover her mouth in shock. How it had happened, she wondered. Different scenarios ran through her mind, though each was as unlikely as the next. Chances were just as good that a man had killed her for her scales as they were that she had died by accident. There were stories of such happening.
My children do not like to talk about it.
Kern mused as he idly toyed with the head of a staff laying close to his chair.
It is why what Damon did to save Anwen is considered taboo.
Realization struck like a bullet, sending Courtney reeling.
She shared her soul with a mortal, and they both died.
Kern nodded.
I believe that to be the origin of his distaste.
He stated.
There have been, of course, other incidents that have colored his perspective. The creation of the Mage Circle, for example. Though there have been many other instances that have led to it. Which is why I'm asking you not to judge him too harshly. His reasons may not be sound, but he was young when his mother died. And when I took Anna Magus as my wife, I fear he felt a deeper sense of betrayal he will never admit to having.
Courtney felt as though the air had been forced from her lungs as she tried to digest what Kern had just told her. It made sense on so many levels, and yet it also seemed so far away from anything she could understand with any certainty. Since Callum had lived a long time, chances were good he kept his feelings of resentment in a deep place. They would not be easily dispelled. Despite that, Kern was asking her not to judge him too harshly. She could see no in-between on the matter. The Nurrim gave her a look of compassion.
I know it will not be easy,
he acknowledged.
The hardest thing for any person to do is to look not on what is represented, but, instead, on why it is there in the first place, to see beyond what is visible. We all have scars, some deeper than others. Those scars form and shape us in ways we don't always understand. And yet we can choose the end result of how we deal with them, see them, and accept them. We are all broken, in one way or another.
Courtney couldn't help but think of those words as she walked back down to join her fellow mages. Kern was right. They were all broken, just differently. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to deal with those who chose to be obstinate about it. But she hoped that with this new insight, she might come to understand Callum better, and with that, feel less offended by his behavior. It might take some time, but she felt she could get there.